welcome to Left Foot Media. My name is Brendan Malone, and it's been a long break between drinks, but we are finally back together. We've got the band back together, the black guy and the white guy, talking about important issues. Kelechi Osunwa, welcome back to Left Foot Media.
Mate, it's good to be back. It's been way too long, and I'm glad that we could have a chat. Unfortunately, we're talking about something that is, controversial as usual. I'd love to have talked about something less controversial, like, free speech or gender or abortion.
Yeah. One of those other safe topics. And to be fair, Kelechi has been in contact quite a bit. And we've been meaning to get back together after our successful discussion of Black Lives Matter and all of those sort of controversies surrounding that. And a lot of people got in contact and said they really enjoyed it. And I know Kelechi and I thought it was really fruitful. So we thought we've got to do this again. But I've been pretty slack. And then, of course, something happened in the last couple of weeks that sort of sparked it all off again. So here we are talking. Hopefully the next discussion, it won't be as long between this one and the next one. But those who are wondering, the reason we have these discussions is I guess we just want to prove a point. Aside from having a fruitful dialogue about important issues and being honest and open about it, well, I guess we want to prove the point that a black guy can talk to a white guy without being a race traitor. A white guy can disagree with a black guy without being a racist. And that what actually, joins us and unites us as human beings is far greater than those disagreements we might have that separate us. And so it's important to have these kind of dialogues, and hopefully in the process we can both get a little bit closer to the truth as we speak honestly and freely about even controversial issues. So Kelechi, welcome back, brother. It's good to have you. You've moved. You're in the UK now too.
Yeah, so I've moved to Manchester of all places. Grew up in Nigeria, went to New Zealand, home as I like to call it. Spent some time in Australia, and now I'm in the UK. So been in all the parts of the colony, so to speak.
So the reason we're back together, actually, I should start by asking: am I allowed to say brother? That's not cultural misappropriation, is it?
No. I'd like to think that my culture is strong enough that a white dude can say brother, as long as you say it with the ER and not the A. That's for us.
I'll do my best. Now, the reason we're here today is because, unfortunately, there was this horrific series of events that took place around Charlottesville in the United States. It sparked off a massive international furor and debate. And to be fair, it's got pretty ugly. I guess we should start by saying and spelling out really clearly that we both think that National Socialism, you might know it as Nazism, that white supremacy or any type of race supremacy movement is vile, it's evil, it separates human beings, it's based on an erroneous and very ugly ideology which fails to see that every human person has an inherent dignity and worth that is equal. And it's just a really divisive and hateful kind of ideology. And I guess the first place that we should start with is asking this question, Kelechi, have things got too far out of hand when a couple of guys like us have to start by actually spelling out clearly that we don't support Nazism or the KKK before we have a discussion about these issues? Have things got out of hand?
That is a really, really funny one. I mean, you'd like to think that these things are just self-evident. These things are just inherent in terms of any cultural ideology that we want to have, especially in the West, especially in a culture or society that preaches freedom, justice, liberty for all, equal rights, and that all men and women are created equal. So it is funny to have to sit there and think that these are actually comments we need to use to start a conversation. But it kind of just shows you how scary the times are. And I suppose at the same time, it also kind of might actually show how wrong we might have America. So I've been doing a whole lot of research around these statues, around what they mean to people, around the alt-right, around the alt-left, and, around President Trump condoning it or condemning it or taking too long, and realizing that, America is really into white supremacy. And it may be overt, as we've seen the other day with people literally walking down the streets and not being terrified of wearing masks to cover themselves up, or whether it is, having a statue that venerates someone like Nathan Bedford Forrest, who was the founder of the KKK. So it's a real interesting one. And hopefully when we speak more about it, it'll just all come out and we'll sit there and be blown away, but also agree and disagree with a whole lot of things as well.
This is where I think our first point of disagreement is going to be, I'm not convinced that America is any more enamored with white supremacy than it has been previously. I still think these groups, by and large, are minority groups. They certainly have followings. And they certainly have been a threat. It's interesting. I'm old enough to remember the likes of Ruby Ridge and David Koresh's Waco and Timothy McVeigh, the Oklahoma City bombing. And there's no doubt there has been some pretty serious attempts in the past by really committed white supremacist groups and sort of, I guess, what you call ultra-nationalist groups to try and overthrow. But in saying that, you go back a little bit further, and also there was a period in American history, just prior to my birth actually, where there was a very, very serious extreme left threat with communist violence and bombings going on in the other direction. So I don't know, and especially when you look around, I think both sides have a problem here. And while there's an alt-right, I think there's also an alt-left, and I'm not convinced. So you're a bit more convinced than I am that there actually is there's a resurgency of some kind going on. I don't think that's necessarily what's happening.
In terms of that, I think you're correct, but I also think that there can be like a little incompleteness there. I don't think that this overly aggressive, overt showing of people coming out and being white supremacists is something that we need to be terrified of, right? Like the chances of you being killed by a white supremacist is less than you falling in your bathtub and dying. What's difficult and what's tricky is this is the first showing in my lifetime where you've got Nazi sympathizers, people with Nazi flags walking down the streets in America, no masks on. That I feel is something that's absolutely new. What's different here is we have individuals who can easily come out and be this extreme, but at the same time take a step back. So there was a meme that I saw that painted it so real for me. It said, if you're looking at this and you see bigots and you see people who are racist and you see people who are race mongers, when you see these photos, you're missing the point that these people can easily take a step back and be part of the mainstream where they can be the person who was preventing you from getting your job. They can be Phil at accounting. They can be the judge, the jury, or the executioner in that regard. And so when I say the white supremacy is never necessarily like taking a step back, we have to sit there and think just in the statue itself. This is a statue of Robert E. Lee. This is the statue of Nathan Bedford Forrest. And just to give you a bit of Nathan Bedford Forrest, he's a slave owner who made money from selling slaves. He gave no quarter to black soldiers. He massacred black soldiers at who tried to surrender at Fort Pillow, and then went and founded the KKK. This person has a monument built to him in the capital, Memphis of Tennessee. So if that's what does that statue, what does that monument say about the people there? And so that's where I sit there and say, look, I don't think the white supremacy has just disappeared and is now just upsurging and being really prominent right now. I think it's always been there, and people have kind of either just left it alone or not spoken about it. And right now the rhetoric is coming to the fore where it's almost mainstream in terms of Richard Spencer.
Okay, let's talk about the cause then. Let's take a step back and say what is the possible cause of that? Because I think there are, like you would look at it, and I'm assuming, or certainly people on the left would look at it and would say, and they're saying Trump's causing this. I look at this from the other one and say that's one possible explanation. Another possible explanation is that what's happened is after a previous presidency, which perhaps enabled certain ideologies that really tried to ground things in these identity politics and really just so obsessed on some of these identity separation points that these people are almost backlashing. It's not necessarily that they now feel empowered, it's that they feel disempowered and angry. So there's two competing theories here, and I'm not convinced that it's clear yet that these people feel empowered over the possibility that they're actually disempowered and angry. And so that's why you see this sort of boldness from them on the streets and the stepping out. Now, we're going to talk about statues in a minute because I think that's a separate question. We've got a whole talking point on that. But to me, like I said, I think the alt-left and the alt-right are a problem. You know, you can't, and this is where one of our first talking points was supposed to be, and let's talk about this now, is the glaring inconsistency perhaps in the media coverage. And to me, like, interestingly enough, though, this week, in the last day or so, it seems like some in the media have started to realise that Antifa are a very serious problem. They are a violent group of thugs. They are not a legitimate political expression. And it's really problematic. Now, that's on one side. And then on the other side, you got a group of people who are turning out with Nazi flags and KKK flags and Confederate flags, not because they're Civil War aficionados. we know that much, you know. So, and it's a problem. But I wonder whether what's really happening is whether they actually are in a moment of supremacy, those problematic groups on the right, and whether they're empowered, or whether actually this is a backlash because the whole discourse and the whole way of thinking about the human person and political issues is broken down previously. See,
this is really interesting. There's three things that you've kind of spoken about there. So the inconsistencies is absolutely true, right? I'm the first person who I actually saw talk about this was Ben Shapiro. And there's a lot of things that I agree with him and a lot of things that I don't agree with him. One of the best things I ever heard him say was, when you have a wife or a girlfriend and she starts to talk to you, ask her, do you want me to listen or do you want me to help you out here and solve this? Best advice anyone has ever given.
He's a very smart man.
Very smart man. And so he then points out the inconsistencies that come out from the reporting of Antifa, noting that these individuals are always there trying to stop free speech. These individuals are basically calling everybody fascist. And because they call everybody fascist, they have the likes of Ben Shapiro and the likes of Richard Spencer lumped into the same group. Now, to a certain extent, I kind of think if your biggest quest in life is to fight for free speech, you're hustling backwards, because police aren't stopping you from saying your piece, right? Like, you're allowed to say your piece. There are going to be repercussions because people like it or don't like it. So that point of view, that fact that Antifa aren't being shown is so true. And to a certain extent, going even further, I think when you are someone who's disenfranchised or who's annoyed and you're seeing the media not constantly show that side of the Antifa, it makes the alt-right much more appealing to you, because you can go on Breitbart and Breitbart will confirm to you that these people were violent and they weren't actually reported by CNN or MSNBC.
But here's the big question, though. Why is it a problem? And it is a problem, by the way, again, to clarify. Why is it a problem if someone marches under a swastika for National Socialism, but it's not a problem if they march under a hammer and sickle, which actually killed millions more people, and in just as brutal and evil a regime under communism? And I see, to me, there's an inconsistency there.
Yeah, it comes down to that, what's one man's hero is another man's freedom fighter, right? And I suppose the biggest thing there is the West has largely gone on about being this moral place, which is largely constructed of white Christian Anglo-Saxon Protestants who are all about freedom, liberty, and justice for all. But then there's a whole lot of hypocrisy around that. And so when you're sitting on the other side and you're looking at that, you can see the disenfranchisement there. You can see the annoyance there. I was also going to say, in terms of the alt-left, it's also really, really hard to sell people that we've got some people who are white supremacists and Nazis, and we've got people who are fighting against them, and the people who are fighting against them are just as bad. That's a really hard sell to make, especially in this climate and day and time. Now, in terms of whether Trump is starting this and Trump is fueling the fire.
Let me stop you there and ask you, why is it a hard sell? Is it a hard sell because you think that people are so scared of Nazis that they're willing to put up with fascists on the other side? Or why is it a hard sell?
I think it's a hard sell because, by and large, you take away the violence and the fascists kind of had some sort of moral grounding around it. You can reason and rationale their morality or their reasons for doing it, right? If a fascist person, someone who's anti-fascist comes and says, well, this person is actually advocating for the subjugation of black people and saying that they're lesser than you, and the subjugation of women and the subjugation of people of color, and wanting this free country to be just white, that's a lot easier to get behind, and you can almost justify it by saying, well, look, to what certain point is it okay to punch a Nazi?
That's a valid question, and my response is, unless that Nazi is assaulting you, or unless you are at war with the Nazis in an actual World War II war, it's never okay to punch a Nazi. Just like it's never okay to punch Antifa, it's never okay to punch a leftist or someone who's on the right or someone who's in the centre. Absolutely,
and I think that's cool. But at the same time, just another point of view here, I have seen so many articles about why it's wrong to punch a Nazi, but the same people who put those articles about why it's wrong to punch a Nazi kept their mouth shut about why Tamir Rice was killed after 9 seconds. So there's a lot of moral inconsistencies that come around there where it's, hey, why are you guys defending these people who are Nazis? Why are you guys defending these people who are wanting an ideology that grandparents and great-grandparents literally fought and died against?
But here's the thing. Are they actually defending Nazism? See, this is my point. I think we're not being nuanced enough. It's like we come into these political debates now with a big broadsword instead of a scalpel. Now, we've always done that, probably, to be fair. Human emotion, we tend to react and we see something and go, ah! But, so for example, are they actually defending Nazis and Nazism, or are they defending a really important principle about non-aggression in our political dialogues, about the idea of a free expression? Do you know what I mean?
No, yes, and I suppose the idea of sitting there and championing free, liberal, Western thinking, right? I think if you're going to champion that, that's 100%. But then, to what extent do we have to hold tolerance to someone sitting there and who's expounding things that are completely the antithesis of our free Western liberal democracy? It's the classic, if we were taken to a school ground, right? You can say whatever you want about my mum, but eventually I might punch you in the face. And you're well within your right to say what you want about my mum. The teachers aren't going to stop you. The police aren't going to stop you. You're well within your right. But I might punch you in the face. And when I punch you in the face, I'm going to say, well, look, you've been talking about my mum for so long. Now, again, that's just high school. That's not necessarily, taken into the context of grown and civilized men, but that's where it ends up kind of falling and becoming. So if we're going to have a society where individuals are out here spewing this hatred and we're going to be defending them and defending them and defending them, to what point do we then actually challenge them and say, look, here's all the facts that you're wrong. Here's all the reasons why the Bell theory is absolutely stupid. Here's all the reasons why you should have been talking about Tamir Rice being killed within 2.5 seconds, rather than sitting there saying, oh, look, actually, I disagree with this Nazi, or I disagree with this white supremacist, but he's well within his right to say that.
Yeah, but here's the thing, though. Like, you going back to your high school example, I would say that you're actually creating a world in which you wouldn't want to live in if that was your reaction, even if it's your mother they're talking about. I understand it. I when I was in school, I did stuff like that, right? But the thing is, we're supposed to grow up at some point and stop acting that way. If we all act like children in a program, we're in trouble, especially as we mature and are talking about political discourse. Because what happens if someone says this? Okay, yeah, it's appropriate. He was talking about your mother. You get offended. You smack him in the face. But what happens if someone says, well, I'm offended by you talking about Arsenal that way. I love Arsenal. How dare you speak badly about my favourite soccer team? And then they smack you in the face. Or someone says, well, I'm offended by you talking about the colour blue in that way because I really love the colour blue. At what point do we actually have an objective line in the sand? It seems to me the only objective line is to say, you don't react violently to people without proper justification, as in self-defence against a physical aggression. That's the only time in which violence would be an acceptable response, is if someone is trying to assault you first and you're trying to defend yourself. Other than that, I think we're opening up effectively just might makes right. Whoever happens to be able to punch the most people is going to win the political dialogue, and that's a scary world to live in, isn't it?
That's absolutely right. I'm going to ask you this question, though. If your dialogue, if your conversation is advocating for the physical domination, for the actual physical subjugation, for the existence of me, what am I supposed to do?
I think if we were living in a society in which society and the structures of society had broken down, and you were talking about being part of that group, where another group is saying that we should dominate and subjugate you, and your only form of defending yourself is to form your own communities, which form defensive perimeters that might involve physical force, then I think that's a different scenario. But I don't think, are we living in that world in the West right now? I don't think we are we? We still have a civil order. No one is suggesting that the government should become Nazi and should start subjugating Jewish people, black people, people who are non-Aryan. So I don't think it's justified to resort with violence in that situation then.
But at the same time, like their entire narrative, their entire philosophy, this white supremacist, this Nazi, this Confederate thinking, like if you actually strip it down, it's baseless. Despite the education, despite the thoughts, despite the theory, despite all the information's out there, it's still continuing, it's still happening. And the fact that the President of the United States comes out and says, well, look, there's some good people here and there's some bad people here, that like the fact that you still, like I said, have this statue of Nathan Bedford Forrest just kicking there, the fact that you've got Robert E. Lee, the fact that you've got monuments to, you've got states and counties named after Alexander Stevens, like that in itself is something that's done towards the psyche of an individual who's having to live in this society. So whether it may not necessarily be the forcefulness of it, and like I said, the chance of actually being killed by a white supremacist or any like racial supremacist is the same as like falling in your bathtub and dying. There is actual structural power there that makes it easy to take a step back and just be part of the mainstream and be part of the norm.
Here's an alternative though. Perhaps, and I want to, let's talk about this alternative idea, because what happened was a lot of people after Charlottesville went on there, they formed witch hunting mobs basically. And they did. And I get it. I understand. If you were on the receiving end of this ideology, then, very directly, I think we all are indirectly. If you're a Christian, even if you're white, you are on the receiving end of Nazi ideology. If you read Hitler's works, he has no time for Christianity at all. And you'll be next cab off the rank. If you're obviously non-Aryan, you're Jewish, you're right up the front of the queue, So there's a lot of us who would sort of be in the firing line here. But I understand if you're directly in the firing line, how the reaction is a lot more visceral. And there's a temptation to think, right, let's get these photographs and find all of these people who are at this rally and let's start social media shaming them until they lose their jobs. My problem with that approach is A, it's a witch hunt. B, we don't even really know who these people are, what they were really doing there. Now, some of them we can say for certain they're right on, full on, confirmed white supremacists. However, there's a lot of people who got hunted down and were pursued in this way that I think there's still big question marks about. This is why we don't do mob justice. And then lastly, and I think most importantly, especially if you're on the left, and I totally agree with this position that the left often talks about, what's the best way to radicalise someone? We understand this from the Middle East. Is you take away their means of gainful employment, you put them in a disenfranchised class, and then you watch as they turn from someone who might be angry at the West to someone who's radicalised. So what happens to a guy like that who's young and foolish and who's bought into a bad ideology, desperately looking for answers, but can be dialogued with and perhaps can come out of it with a peaceful negotiation. But in the process, he gets hunted down by a witch mob, loses his job, and then starts to get really angry. And potentially, isn't he now a potential radical of the really dangerous kind on the supremacist side? So I don't know if this, surely the peaceful option is still the best, even if it hurts and there's great risk involved and it's slower to actually do it that way.
All right, so 2 takes. One, you're talking to the wrong guy because I have actually done something like this, which led to a person losing their position. Let me tell the full story.
Yeah, you better do that. I'm hitting the delete button. No, tell the story.
As the president of a football club. 2, why don't we take that approach to first-time offenders? So we can actually say, look, well, the best thing to do is actually rehabilitate you. We never take that position of empathy to certain people who don't necessarily look like us or have the same history of us, or we can't necessarily empathize with. And I'm exactly the same when I'm doing my coaching courses as well. But so here's the story that I want to say. The Sydney siege happens in Melbourne, right? The absolute nut job who turns up to the Lent Cafe and holds people hostage and ends up killing a person. The president of a football club here in Perth, Australia, comes out and says he doesn't want any Muslims to play in his football club. I say, well, look, that's absolutely fine and fair, but is that the position of your football club? And he says, no, it's just my position. And I said, and you're the president? He said, yes. So the president of this football club is essentially saying you don't want Muslims to play there. He said, no. I said, well, good. What we need to do is make sure that other people now know this, so then they can then decide whether they can go to your football club or whether that football club is for them. Let's make sure that other people who are part of your football club know that this is where you stand. And if they agree with that, cool. So in that regard, I'm pretty libertarian in the point of view of let the company know. And if the company decide that they want to have this person there, they can then decide whether they want to keep that person there, knowing full well that they might have employees, they might have contractors, they might have people who are sponsors who don't necessarily agree with this person's position or the company's position. So I myself, there was a rally here for Black Lives Matter a couple months ago, and I had to sit there and speak to my boss about whether I should go or not. My boss then decided, look, I insist you go and I insist you hold a plaque. My boss was cool about that. I got to go. If my boss was not cool about that, if the people were not cool about that, I'd have to go back into work the next day with this kind of politics or attitude. Now, if that person who was at this white supremacist rally turns up to work with women of color, with people of color, with other people from different races who were there, what's it say about the company if those people then are in this place where they can know that this person here who might be in charge of my payslip, who might be in charge of my progress, who might be in charge of my career, does not like me simply because of the color of my skin.
And I totally get that, and I agree. I think these are not necessarily black and white issues in regards to, it's just always free speech. No, that you have to balance against other people's responsibilities and your responsibilities towards other people. However, I would say in the examples that you're giving, first of all, the example of the soccer club, you actually went and clarified that was definitely his position, right? But what I saw going on social media was, there's a photo of a guy, let's just identify and assume that he's there for this reason. But so the problem is if you've verified someone like you did, it's clear cut. But if you've got someone in a photo who's holding a big sign that says, I hate black people, you've verified it, right? It doesn't get much clearer than that. And they try and turn up to work the next day. Yeah, I got no sympathy for you. But if you've got people who you're just in a crowd, there's a guy over there, because there were several people who were wrongly identified. Now that's, you know what I mean? There's a guy who's like, I wasn't even there. I'm not that guy. But they're like, no, that looks like that guy. You know?
Now, wrongfully identifying someone is one thing. But being in a group where people are literally saying Jews will not replace us, that's one thing. Yeah. If I turned up to a rally, I was at the Australia Day rally for the Change the Date a couple years ago. And there were a couple of chants where I was just like, I'm not actually comfortable with this chant. So I had to actually sit there and internalize myself and say, well, am I comfortable with this chant or not? So either A, I don't sing it, or I get out of that group. But then I had to sit there and say, well, you know what? Actually, always was, always will be Aboriginal land kind of makes sense to me, and I can morally justify that to myself. So if you're in this group and they're saying Jews will not replace us, you need to sit there and go, oh, shit, what am I actually speaking about? And furthermore, I think once we start speaking about these statues, you'll realize firsthand that these statues are completely about white supremacy.
Let's go back to that chant example that you used, because I think that's a valid and a good way of thinking about it. What was the chant, exactly the chant that you were comfortable with, the Aboriginal one? What was the exact wording of it?
When they started chanting, always was, always will be Aboriginal land, I was like, oh, well, I don't know, man. People turned up and bought land. I don't know the juxtaposition of that. And then I sat down and was like, you know what? No, I'm completely...
And here's the example. So you chant that, right? And there's nuance there. You don't mean no white people allowed. You know, so isn't it possible that you've got people in that crowd who are thinking no Jews allowed, and others who are thinking, who have a chip on their shoulder about whatever they perceive the Jewish-controlled media, whatever they think it is, and so they're not necessarily meaning that they should be booted out, but they think that they are not being fairly treated and they should get some equality. Do you know what I mean? Like, isn't it possible? I'm not saying it is. I'm saying, isn't it possible there's nuance there?
I do think that it's possible, but at the same time, like if we look at the complete holistic approach of this rally, of the symbolism, of the flags, of the nature of it, it wasn't something about like Southern pride. We had people from Ohio driving all the way down to Virginia to take part in something about Southern pride. We had people with Polish last names who were out here talking about like white Southern supremacy or white Southern like heritage and history. So we need to actually rip through the nuance. And I genuinely think once we actually start speaking about these statues, what they mean, who these people are, what they've said and what they fought for, there's no way you can sit there and say, well, look, actually, you know, these guys were just here like talking about their heritage. I can understand there's some disenfranchised individuals who are not necessarily sure, who are looking for community. I get that. And I completely do. And as I said earlier, if you were targeting these people incorrectly, if you were giving fuel to the alt-right, if you're being unbiased, if you're being biased, or if you're being unbalanced with your assessment of things, you're going to stoke the flames of people actually joining them, and you'll absolutely stoke the flames of otherwise unoffending individuals who are just trying to find out like their set of it. They're frustrated nerds who are on bloody 4chan and Reddit and just wanting to be a part of something. Like, I completely get that. But at the same time, when do we like stop treating them with kid gloves? Because like I said, people of color aren't treated with kid gloves.
Oh, sure. And I can understand that position, right? It's like, well, why are they treated that way? And you don't argue for, and I agree that the point you made about first time offenders, because I actually have sympathy with that. I don't think that the hard punitive response to a first time, particularly a young offender, I think all you do, if you put them in jail at a very young age, you effectively, it becomes a gladiator academy and they come out worse. There's a lot of research to back that up. So I'd agree with you on that. But I don't think it changes the principle necessarily, even if it's a separate argument in some ways to say, why aren't we now applying this principle consistently? You know, to people who are of colour, for example, why aren't we giving them the same leniency that we want to, or that same nuance that we should be giving here? I think we should. I think it should be across the board. And this is my problem, is that the media coverage was very much, they went looking for what they wanted to see. There is such I don't care what you think about Trump. There's no doubting there's a very anti-Trump and very intense anti-Trump focus in the media right now. They're looking for every little thing, because the simple fact is that speech that he gave, when I first heard about it, I thought, oh my gosh, that just sounds so awful. Then I went and watched the speech and I was like, well, actually, I want to talk about the first speech he gave. It wasn't actually that bad. He did clearly condemn, this is not who we are, it's hate, rah, rah. And then, interestingly enough, doing a bit of research, when we had the Dallas police shooting, where a black man targeted white police officers because they were white, which was racist killing, right? It doesn't get any more obvious than that. Just like a guy targeting someone because they're black. It's pretty simple, straightforward stuff. Obama gave a speech that was very similar. He never came out and necessarily condemned black racism. In fact, he didn't, if you go back and look at it. So I don't understand why. So part of it, I think, is we're actually empowering these extreme fringe movements, and we're turning them into these big, massive monsters. But really, in actual fact, I think because of our outrage and the outrage machine and our inability to dialogue well and to see nuance, we're actually giving them more credence than they really are due. And if you pull back the curtain, it's just a little old white dude with a hood on, pulling some levers and you think it's this big dragon. I'm not necessarily convinced that we're helping the situation by this type of extreme sort of reaction ourselves.
You're right in that there is a lot of outrage media towards what Trump says and what Trump does, right? Like Trump said this, Trump did that, Trump had a rally and he opened his rally with look at the size of this crowd, and like we know this. Like I don't need to get notifications every day from MSNBC telling me what Trump has said and had for dinner and had for breakfast. Like that's completely true. At the same time, there's consistency there from a Barack Obama who right from the start and has been this middle of the road, I'm everybody's president. Every time he criticizes Black America, he criticizes white America. Every single time. That's very consistent with President Barack Obama. We look at Trump and we can categorically say that the first speech when he sat there and he read out, you're just going, all right, cool. And in the second one that he comes out with both sides, and he talks about that, right? You can tell which one is more him and which one is more him just being forced to do something because he's the president of the United States of America. And it's that inconsistency that he has shown time and time again.
Let me call you up on that, but because this is what I'm seeing a lot of people doing, is they say, oh, I know what Trump's really on about, but can you really tell that? Because so much of our perception of who he is coloured by what we are being told about the guy by all sorts of commentary, which I think has just become quite unhinged, a lot of it. Now, I'll spell it out just in case anyone's wondering. Trump says some really dumb and very stupid things, at times that are even vile, and I actually would really like it if someone would take his Twitter account off him, for starters, right? But I think at the same time, there is also an inconsistency. Why do we judge Barack Obama differently when he doesn't specifically condemn black racism? You know, shouldn't we be taking it as read that when he talks about hate, and this is not part of who we are, that he means that kind of hate as well? That he doesn't necessarily need to name it explicitly?
Again, you're absolutely right in terms like just the frontal face of it. But again, looking into the context, there's history and there's precedent of Trump stoking the flames of the alt-right. There's Trump literally having someone in his cabinet who had Breitbart Media, where Milo Yiannopoulos, I don't know how to say his name. Basically came out and said that we are the alt-right and said that Breitbart was an absolute platform for it. There's the KKK founder, Grand Wizard David Duke, basically coming out and saying, well, thank you so much, Donald Trump, for actually saying the truth and basically saying, these are promises that you have made for us. We want to hold you accountable to it. There's Trump's 1970s housing discrimination against black people. There's his early 90s issues with his native Indian casinos where he would dispute if the person was native Indian enough to hold titles. There's the comments about not wanting blacks to count his money.
Okay, let's take a step back then. Like some of those, the Milo Yiannopoulos thing, I've actually just recently, just quietly, don't tell anybody, I just read Dangerous, his book, because I thought, well, I want to understand the guy for myself, and he very clearly spells it out. I am not alt-right, I never have been, and that was a complete mischaracterization. And he's very clear in that, and I think, to be fair, he actually cites examples, he provides the references where he came out and clearly said, that's not who I am, and it's not, and I think it's pretty hard to make that case when, as he himself says, I'm a gay Jew who has a black boyfriend. It is kind of hard to make the case that this guy is signing up to be part of the KKK. But I guess the point I'm making is that you can go back and find examples, though, if you want to, in other previous presidents, and I think Barack Obama being the previous one, where you can see similar mistakes that would actually, you could accuse some of those same things of those men, but for some reason, and I think I know why. It's because none of us like to admit that our guy on our side of the fence is imperfect. You know, we like to hold him up as, you know.
People absolutely gave Barack Obama a pass on a whole lot of things, right? Simply because it was Barack Obama. People gave him a whole, because there's an article by Ta-Nehisi Coates that's so critical of Barack Obama and his dealings with black Americans and how terrible he was. There's Iraq, there's Afghanistan.
The drone killing program.
There's a program where he gave himself complete authority. Like, there is a complete bias towards that. Let's not put that aside. But at the same time, let's not simply say, well, look, because we did it to Barack Obama, because we don't do it to Barack Obama, let's not do it to Trump. To a certain extent, Trump has woken people's consciousness to the point where they're actually now more politically active and much more politically engaged now than they've ever been before in their lives. So we can't now get mad at people for being critical of some guy because they weren't critical of the person before when they're just waking up and being conscious. But I wanted to ask you, going back to the previous topic, what did you think the rally was about? What did you think the other people, otherwise unoffending people, what do you think they turned up to this rally for?
Here's how I understand it. It was from what my reading of all sides, trying to get a different media, different commentary from people. As my understanding, it was there was initially a rally about people got angry about the removal of the statue, the proposal to remove the statue. Then there was a whole thing about let's unite the right, and then what happened was you got some white supremacists, and National Socialists who jumped on board and said, this is our chance to really shine. And that you had a whole mix of people. Oh, and there was some free speech people in there as well, as I understand it. And so you've got a group of people who are all mixed in together and who are there not necessarily at all for the same motivation, which is the one that's been touted is that they were there for the white supremacy motivation primarily. But I think it's actually a bit more confused than that when you look at what people are actually saying about why and they attended and what the purpose of it was.
Yeah, like I said, if your biggest fight in life is the free speech, I think you're living a really good life and you have nothing to worry about. I think life was great for you. If you're turning up and coming down from Ohio to protect to protest the removal of a Confederate statue of Robert E. Lee, we need to sit here and ask questions why.
Let's take a step back then. So if you talk about free speech being your biggest fight, I would say depends on the context. I had dinner the other night. I spoke at a public meeting in another part of the country the other night, and I had dinner with a lady, her and her husband. They came from Croatia, and they lived and grew up under communism. And for free speech, man, they'd kill you for free speech over there. So I don't necessarily think just because that's your primary focus that means that you are living the good life at all. I think that that's all about context. However, I can agree in this situation, if you're putting free speech ahead of other basic human needs that are not being met in your society, then maybe there's the problem. But I still think it's an important principle because perhaps the whole platform of freedom of conscience, which is really what we're talking about, allows us then to have those important discussions about those other issues, and without it, we could get in trouble in those regards. Now, in regards to turning up to protest a statue, yep, there's one group of people who will come there and go, how dare they take away my KKK statues? This guy was a great white man who led us into some white purity that's now been tainted, right? Or there's people who turn up, and let's talk about statues now, who are, I wouldn't turn up to a protest, but for me, I'm a little bit mixed on this because I worry that when you start destroying statues that have been there for generations and generations, you're actually, again, where do we draw the line here and why are we actually doing it? And isn't it possible that some people turn up to protest something like that, not because they think Robert E. Lee's necessarily that great, but because they have a principle about how we should treat our history, and you shouldn't necessarily treat history in this way, even if you disagree with a figure like what Lee and what he stood for. There's also an important point of those things remind us of that vile past and we don't want to go back there.
Okay, so drawing the line and our history, big ones, right? I contend that because we don't fully treat and teach history in a 360 point of view, we don't know where to draw the line. And I say that because history predominantly is written by the winners, right? You win the war, you win the battle, you win the ideology culture, you win the thought culture, you then decide to write history. But now the losers of history, the people who were previously disenfranchised, are still alive, are now talking, and now given a 360-degree lens and point of view of history. And I think, unfortunately, we're not being taught full history. We're not being taught nuanced history enough that we can then decide to draw the line where we can sit there and say, you know what, Emmeline Pankhurst, the suffragette, was great to give women free speech and free rights, right? But she only gave it to middle-class women, and she did not give it to a woman of color. Whereas we had Kate Shepherd, who was sensational, who wanted free speech, who wanted voting rights for everybody. We don't teach that history. We don't sit there and think about Churchill in that way where we go, you know what, Churchill, absolutely amazing, helped save us in World War II. And we completely forget that he was a complete white supremacist who was responsible for killing 3 million Bengals. If we put that into context, we can sit there and say, you know what, this is what he did. This is what else he did. This is the context that we want to make sure that we learn it in, and we can put this on the plaque or put this on everything. The same goes for someone like Nelson Mandela. We all love Nelson Mandela. We don't know that he was absolutely okay with the bombing of a hospital full with children. We don't teach this history. Now, going back and sitting there and going, where do we draw the line? I think we can easily draw the line in terms of saying what do this person's actions say about freedom, justice, liberty, equality for everybody? Let me give you a quick statement here from the state of Georgia before they actually decided to succeed, right? So they said, the party of Lincoln, called the Republican Party, under its present name and organization, is of recent origin. It is admitted to be an anti-slavery party. While it attracts itself by its creed and scattered advocates of exploiting political heresy, of condemning theories of political economy, and advocates for the commercial restrictions of protections, of special privileges, of weights of corruption, of administration of government, anti-slavery, it's its mission and purpose. By anti-slavery, it has made its power in the slate. The question of slavery was the great difficulty in the way of the formation of the Constitution. We have these people literally saying what they're all about. We have the Confederacy saying that. We have Hale saying it. We have Robert E. Lee saying it, and saying that they literally decided to go to war for slavery and to completely adopt white supremacy, making sure that people could grow up in a state which believed in these things and believed in these laws. Here's another one from Hale. Therefore, it is that the election of Mr. Lincoln cannot be regarded otherwise than a solemn declaration on the part of the great majority of the northern people of hostility to the South, her property and her institutions. Nonetheless, that an open declaration of war. For the triumph of this new theory of government destroys the property of the South, lays waste to her fields, and inaugurates all the horrors of the San Domingo Servile insurrection, consigning her citizens to assassination and her wives and daughters to pollution and violation, to gratifying the lust of half-civilized Africans. If these are the people that we are venerating, these are the people we're making statues of, what does that say about us? And then what does it say about us that we don't learn that side of it? And that when we do learn that side of it, rather than get rid of it, we sit there and we hold steadfast to it. What's that say?
Well, here's the question. Here's the question then. Once you start down the path of saying, well, let's just get rid of these statues, where do you stop? Because as I see it, it seems that you would be advocating effectively for no statues, because every single person you can find, or almost every single person, unless you're talking about Mother Teresa or someone along those lines, you're going to be able to find a valid reason to remove any memorialisation of that person for what they have or haven't done, other than previous erroneous ideologies and errors about the human person that they've bought into. So Barack Obama, right? He will be remembered for certain things that he did well, and the first black president, etc. But in future generations, I'm pretty confident that we're going to look back on the issue of abortion and we're going to say, it was pretty vile and wrong, but we actually were pro-choice as a society on that act. Right? Now, what happens at that point when you've got a guy who did these certain great things, but then also bought into and was very committed to a pro-choice ideology on the ending of innocent life in a womb? You know what I mean? Should that statue be destroyed at that point? Now, with Robert E. Lee, I think in some ways it's a little bit perhaps cleaner and clearer. Certainly with Bedford, because these guys fought for slavery, right? But Churchill, for example,
This is what I mean, though. This is what I mean is we don't teach the history. Basically, man, for me, looking at all of this is whether we like it or not, we are comfortable with white supremacy. Like whether we like it or not, we are comfortable with it. And if we're not comfortable with it, we would put plaques about Woodrow Wilson to say that he was an absolute segregationist. He filled his cabinet with segregation, and he made it really, really tough and hard for black people to actually get jobs in the government. If we were completely comfortable with sitting here and telling the truth and actually dismantling things like white supremacy, we would speak about Churchill killing, like literally having food go past India, where starvation was happening, where they took food away from, go past India, go to England for the purpose of knowing that if they won the war, they'd have plenty of food left over to start selling and be in a better position. Like if we tell this history, it completely goes against this narrative of people of color being noble savages who need to be taken.
But is that, I don't know. Is it fair though to say that ignorance, because it could well be, and I think for a lot of people it is ignorance, is a sign of a genuine comfortability with white supremacy? Or is it the fact that perhaps someone like Churchill, those horrible things that are part of who he is, are completely usurped by the fact that he led a very important defence against a very evil ideology that threatened the whole world. And so we focus on that and ignore the other stuff. Not necessarily because it's convenient to do so, because we like white supremacy. It's just because the big stuff eclipses perhaps that other stuff.
Yeah, sure, cool. But then again, this then becomes a bit out where we draw the line then. So if we're just going to sit there and focus on the big stuff, then yeah, let's have one of Ely. Like legitimately, like let's have one of Ely because he fought for his people. It was a lost cause, and he championed the South. Like if we're going to sit there and again, like I say, it comes back to what we as a society decide is important to us to hold. So if we're going to sit here and say it's peace, justice, liberty, equality for all, and being truthful, then we can't put up a plaque of Churchill and not have any of that information. We can't have history books. There are schools named after Robert E. Lee that are 89% black in Atlanta, and no one is talking about that side of it.
Like, I agree, and I think we've got to be mature enough to put all the history on the table. I think it's important. I don't have a problem with that, because I'd like to think that I am open enough and nuanced enough to be able to look and understand and put it into a context and say he's part of a culture. And so, like, for example, when people talk about the fact that there's a lot of black on black slavery, and we don't talk about that because that doesn't, but I think I'm okay with putting that into a context. So I don't buy into the myth of the noble savage, because in actual fact, when you look at it, it's a pretty mixed bag. The Aztecs, for example, they set the bar pretty high for innocent human slaughter and sacrifice, right? And then I don't buy into this whole thing of that just because there were certain advances in, say, English culture and certain advantages, that means that everything they did was right and good as well, and was of benefit to the world,
No, but again, and this is where I come back to like the comfortability of white supremacy is, then we can then sit there and say, well, look, everything that we did was okay and absolutely right. Like right now in New Zealand, I remember last year they were having conversations whether they would teach Māori history. We're not even comfortable teaching Māori history. We're not even comfortable teaching Māori in schools right now. So what's that say about us as a society in terms of the culture that we want to bring in and go for? And so this is where I say, in terms of, for me, if it fits in with your culture and your narrative, leave the statue up there. But then what does it say about your culture? So I've got no problem with you leaving a statue of Churchill up there. But I want to make sure that when we teach about Churchill, we teach the entire 360 history about Churchill. I've got no entire context and problem with you having a Robert E. Lee statue up there. But what does it say about you, your civilization, your society, and the thoughts that you actually believe in, that when you sit there and say that we condemn white supremacy, but we have a plaque of Bedford, like just kicking back in our state capital, that we have a 65-foot like monument to Robert E. Lee. Like, what does it say about us?
Look, and I look, here's my response to that. I think that some cases are very clear cut. So you got a guy who is engaged, like you wouldn't put a statue of Hitler up, right? It's pretty clear cut. At the same time, I think there's a second tier back from that, where their culture of the day bought into erroneous ideas about the human person and how they should or shouldn't be treated, and had bad ethical ideas as a result. Even though they were pretty advanced for their time, they also had bad ideas that we would look back on today and say, no, that was terrible. But it's in some ways, I think that second tier is where I get concerned, is we're now going to start judging history with our modern corrective. And I think that's real dangerous when you start doing that. And I also, the other point I think is important to make the question it's worth asking is, why is the statue there? Is the statue of a particular person there because we want to memorialise their belief that slavery might be okay, or their belief in eugenics? Or is it there because we thought it was awesome that they saved us from the Nazis? Or we thought that, in actual fact, that it was wrong in the way in which Lincoln tried to actually forcefully bring about change in America, and so they were fighting like a principle of constitution or something. Do you know what I mean? So the question is, why is the statue there? Now, in some cases, I think it's pretty clear cut still. But I think those nuanced points matter.
If we look at the erection of Confederate statues, I remember seeing the timeline of it. A lot of it happened in the 1920s, right after blacks had come back from fighting in the World War and were saying we need some rights. And the other big time it happened was in the 1960s. They were erected when black people were literally saying, hey, look, let's get some civil rights. And it was an absolute monument and testament to white supremacy. So when people are coming all the way from Ohio, who have never been part of the Confederacy, who are turning up to go and do this rally, you need to sit there and say, look, what are you actually rallying for? Because if you know that this is what E. Lee is, this is what you know what Stonewall Jackson is, this is what you know what Thomas Davis is about, what does it say about you? What does it say about us?
But here's the thing. If I go back and go back to your original point, I think in some ways you've got to stop and think about what you first said. There are a lot of people who are actually very ignorant of their history. And so therefore, is it not possible, apart from the clear KKK supremacist guys who are there for those reasons, is it not possible a lot of people are at this rally who are ignorant of actual history, and they're not fighting for that because they don't realise that's actually what the real issue is here. And so therefore, why do we come down on them with such an extreme reaction and lump everyone together when possibly they're not all actually motivated by the same thing. And that's where the danger lies for me.
I think you're right, but again, like we're treating these people with kid gloves here. That's where I sit there and say, look, by and large, America, be it Trump, be it Reagan being endorsed by the Ku Klux Klan in the 1980s. There's a great article called "Fighting the Far Right in the Area of Reagan," which talks about it. It's by my good friend Branko. Like, it breaks it down and says, no, America has always been comfortable with this. America has always been comfortable flirting with white supremacy, taking a step back when it needs to. Flirting with white supremacy, taking a step back when it needs to. Let's not forget that these people have enough information and time that they can become like, they can go on Reddit, they can go on like Tumblrs, they can go on 4chans, they can learn all these nuanced things about meme culture, but God forbid they learn that Robert E. Lee was an absolute prick. Like, where does this balance lie? If I can find out that Malcolm X had some amazingly stupid views at his earlier years in life, and then turn out to be like, you know what, I'm actually absolutely for it. If I can find out that Martin Luther King met with the KKK a bunch of times and agreed with them in terms of having segregational policies, then why can't we sit there and find stuff about Robert E. Lee? And the truth is, it's not being taught. Why? Because people are comfortable with sitting there. And
I'm not sure, actually. I think that's one interpretation. Another interpretation is possibly that, in actual fact, in the South in particular, the Civil War is still a very sore point of contention for a lot of people. Believe it or not, it really is. And their view of the Civil War, and regardless of what they think about the slavery angle, is quite different to what it is on the northern side. And it's quite conceivable still that there's more nuance here still than just, oh, I love racism, or I want to be a supremacist, and I don't want to just admit to that, so let's keep the statue up here. I actually think it's dangerous to try and colour people, just like it would be dangerous to say that everyone who associated with the likes of Nelson Mandela was a terrorist, you know, because he was once at a point in his life, or that they all endorse that. Do you know what I mean? I think this is what I see going wrong right now in our dialogue. We have got extreme tribalism, and there's no nuance. We're not actually asking critical questions and thinking critically. It's false dichotomy. It's like, okay, you're either not a racist or a full-on KKK member, you know, and there's no in between. There's no possibility that someone might hold erroneous ideas out of ignorance, or that someone might not be in either camp, if you like, in the sense they're not racist, but at the same time they're not buying into KKK. So me sitting here today, making the points I'm making, I would hate for anyone to watch this and think, oh, that guy secretly wants to be a white supremacist. I really don't. You know what I mean? But that's the danger when you have that, we try and blanket everyone in the same, you know?
But like, see, this is the other thing there. Like, when we talk about Southern pride, do we talk about Southern black pride? 1 in 3 people are black. 1 in 3 people have to sit there and see the Confederate flag, see the stars and bars, and go through all of that, right? And at the same time, like these quotes that I'm about to read you are said by Confederate generals and said in their petition letters. So here's one. Our position is thoroughly identified with the institution of slavery, the greatest material interest of the world. Its labor supplies a product which constitutes by far the largest and most important proportions of commerce of the earth. These products are peculiar to the climate virgin on the tropical regions, and by an imperious law of nature, none but the black race can bear exposure to the tropic sun. These products have become necessities of the world, and a blow at slavery is a blow at commerce and civilization. That blow has been long aimed at this institution and was at the point of reaching its consumption. There was no choice left us but submission to the mandate of obligation or dissolution of the Union, under which principles have been subverted to work our ruin. This is the Confederacy literally saying, this is why we went to war. This is the belief that we have. So why not sit there and say, you know what? I don't agree with this. The entire purpose of this war is not something that we want to agree with now, and take the step back from it. In terms of being proud of being Southern, absolutely fine. In terms of being proud of being white, absolutely fine. I'm here for Irish Days. I am here for St. Patrick's Days. I'm here for St. Andrew's Days. I'm here for drinking grappa with my Macedonian friends. I'm here for all of it. But if
you're here for any day where there's drinking.
Oh man, I'm here for anyone who's out here doing it for the culture. Right?
Yeah.
Luckily for me, as a Nigerian guy, a Nigerian New Zealander, I can go back and trace my heritage and history and look at it and say, look, this is what I need to be proud of. This is what I don't need to be proud of. My last name literally means served by sons of slaves. So my family owned slaves. And I can sit there and say, you know what? I don't actually want to have any part of that history. So why can't other people sit there and say, you know what? If I'm going to be proud of my heritage, I'm going to be proud of the Irish. I'm going to be proud of the Jewish. I'm going to be proud of the Scottish part of it. I don't want to have any part of this white pride nonsense. But at the same time, I can can sit here and say that, look, this war that started, the civilization that we're talking about, was literally built on white supremacy and slavery. Why is that so difficult for people to sit there and take? And it's because it's easy for them not to.
Or possibly it's a bit more nuanced than that still, because I look at our society right now. There are a lot of people who are doing great humanitarian works in our society, but who also are pro-choice on the killing of human beings in a womb. Now, if we look back at future, and I think future generations, a bit further down the track, will look back with a lot of horror on the acceptance of that practice. What's going to happen when we look back at those people? Are we going to actually take a nuanced view and say, okay, they did some good, and they also bought into erroneous ideologies because they were so prevalent in their day? Or are we going to write off everything and say they hated human beings and they were murderous? You know what I mean? Like, to me, it seems that, like, some cases are clear cut. If you got guys like you've quoted here who are going to war to defend slavery, that's pretty clear cut, right? I don't think it's not like, maybe there's nuance. Maybe there's some nuance in that, but then there is a step back from that. I don't think you take a Churchill, for example. I think he's a step back from that. There's good and there's bad, and they're both wrapped up in the same. And the same is true, I think, for all of us and a lot of our great humanitarians today. And I worry that we're going to end up with this sort of utopianist, almost puritanical belief that if we start, if we demonize everything from the past, somehow we think we're progressing towards perfection or that we've got it all together, when in actual fact that really isn't the case. And I see a lot of great danger in that. I don't have a problem with having a discussion about whether or not, because you're right, why should there be a statue of someone who fought for slavery? What are you really saying with that statue? I think that's a pretty obvious question and a clear that should be asked.
And in terms of us moving forward as society, and look, who knows, we come back and sit here and say, like, I can't believe we actually came through inside of abortion. Sure. But we get to sit here in that time and say, well, what does it say about our society now? What values do we want to have moving forward? And so, like you're saying, maybe in 300 years' time, they look back at it and say, okay, look, actually the people who were dropping drones, unforgivable. So Barack Obama, we cannot forgive you whatsoever. But the people who are actually who were for Planned Parenthood, who were for pro-choice and all that kind of stuff, they become the second tier. But that's where that nuance comes along, where we can sit there and have these discussions and say, they did this, they did this. Hopefully they treat our history and give it a complete holistic approach of our history, rather than simply saying Christopher Columbus was a hero.
Yeah. Yeah.
And that's where the veneration comes through, because we put statues of people who we want to venerate, not people who we want to forget, right?
Again, this does raise that question. Are you remembering or are you venerating? Because they are two different things. Is a memorial of people who died in the Civil War a veneration of what they stood for, or is it a memorial and a reminder of what happened, and perhaps an important reminder of what we don't ever want to go back to? Because surely that's a good... Now, Robert E. Lee's different. But what about a memorial that listed the names of people who fought under his flag?
Let's put a memorial down. Let's put some names to the people who actually fought and died. Let's put a name to the 96% of people who could not afford to buy slaves but were happy to live in that society because it made them feel important. Let's do that. But when we put a bust of Bradford Forrest up there, what's it say about us? When we put a bust of Robert E. Lee, 62 feet, by the way, tall bust of Robert E. Lee, what's it say about us?
They don't do anything small in the South, mate. So
that's incredible.
They're consistent.
That's absolutely incredible. I think that statues are complete veneration. We are literally memorializing somebody for all time. For all time. The statue comes through, it gets cleaned, it gets polished, people come around, they take photos of the statue. That's what we're doing. In terms of remembering, we've got museums, we've got history books. I wouldn't trust an American history book to save my life, but we've got museums and we've got history books. People still know who Malcolm X is. I don't think there's a statue of Malcolm X kicking it back.
But here's the danger I see. Like you talked about not trusting history books. And look, I think you're right. You do have to think critically and read scholarly about these things. But here's the danger. Human nature is human nature. That line between good and evil runs through the heart of every person, whether they're black, white, brown, whatever they are. There is also a danger that you can end up with the other extreme where people say, all right, let's scrub all that horrible history and let's teach very clearly. And I think we should teach openly. No, don't hold anything back about all these evils that these white guys were doing. And let's not talk so much about some of the evils that were going on in our own African cultures at the time. Because, again, why? Human nature is human nature. So I think I'm not necessarily convinced that you're ever going to find a perfect almost utopian balance where we will just teach honesty about everyone and everything. There is a tendency in the human heart, I think, to want to say, well, no, that don't talk about that.
And this is where I keep coming back to saying, then what does it say about our society? Are we truly for justice, freedom, equality, liberty? Are we truly for all these things if we're going to wash away some certain sins and leave it alone? If we are, if that's who we are, that's cool. Let's look in the mirror and say, this is who we are. But
to be for those things, you have to first be for truth. And that's a big problem for our society at the moment. We are very relativistic. And this is where, let's talk about identity politics now, because I think we're becoming too mired in identity politics. And identity politics is so relativist. It binds people, I think, into these little, very narrow ways of thinking. And what tends to happen is I think truth often becomes the first casualty in that approach. And that concerns me. Because, how do you have justice? How do you have peace? How do you have equality if you don't actually hold fundamentally that these things are objectively true, and it's objectively true that they should always be considered as supreme virtues or principles that should govern the way we interact with each other?
All right, cool. Just really quickly, give me your idea of what you think identity politics is and isn't, just really quickly.
Okay, well, I think when I talk about identity politics, I am talking about here that expression which would try and ground my view of the world primarily or even solely through the lens of identity. So I start saying, for example, you're a white person, you have privilege. Every white person fits into that category. I identify them by their I make the racial distinction. Or I'm a white supremacist and I say, yes, those people of colour are inferior races. Mine is privileged and superior. And they're all, do you know what I mean? That's when I talk about identity politics, and that's why I think it's on both sides. That's why we're getting it. And I think it's becoming problematic because it's really starting to become very divisive. I have no problem at all, and I don't think it's identity politics to say, well, I'm Irish, or I'm of African heritage, or, and my family, we have this experience of what it was like growing up and the way we were treated, for example, So, yeah.
So I think I have this crazy idea where I think everything is identity politics. I have this crazy idea where I think everything's identity politics. And to a certain extent, you're either closer to the establishment or you're anti-establishment and you're moving further and further away. And so for a long time, that establishment was white, Christian, Anglo-Saxon. And then it became like Irish, right? So if you look at American history, when the Irish first turned up, they were treated like crap. Then they slowly stopped being Irish and they started just becoming American. And so they stopped being Irish American and just became Americans. When the Polish came, they stopped being Polish and they just became Americans. When the Germans came, they stopped being. And so right now we don't have German Americans. We don't have Polish Americans. Only when it's like convenient for people to call someone the Polish rifle because he has a great arm and his last name ends in ski. Then it becomes convenient for people to like bring that there. But we still have African Americans. We still have Asian Americans because they can't shed their Africanness or they can't shed their Asianness and just become Americans. And so looking at America, just as an example, you still end up having this identity where because we fit a certain bill, we can get away with anything or we can be fine with anything, or we're not necessarily part of the anti-establishment. And so when I look at America in terms of the laws that they created, the way that they structured things, the way that things are working right now, I sit there and say, look, if you fall within this identity, if you're easy example, if you're conservative, chances are you want small government, chances are you want a lot of freedom of speech, chances are you want people to leave your guns alone, for example. We want to worship Tim Tebow and kick back and listen to Joel Osteen. Cool, right? And if you're not, then you fall on the other side of that. I think that is completely identity politics as well. For example, New Zealand, when we say be Kiwi, we don't say be Māori. So if that's the case, I think everything is identity politics. And then you have absolute loons who are completely on the fringe, who are now saying, because you're a white dude, you cannot empathize with me. I've had to have conversations with people in my own community simply and tell them, hey, just because you're black doesn't mean you can't be racist. Let's get this clear.
Well, here's the thing then. I could possibly buy into that theory. I'm not convinced that's necessarily identity politics, though, but I can buy into it. I in the sense that I think our identity is important to us. Our heritage and stuff matters, and we do think a lot about it. And by the way, in the issue here in New Zealand, I'm all in favour. I've come out publicly a couple of times and said this. I really want my kids to learn te reo. I want them to learn Māori. Because it's part of their history, right? They should know it. But anyway, that's a separate point. I think what we've seen now is an imposition on this idea of of celebration of diversity, there's an imposition of Marxism happening. And what's happening is you've got people now who are actively buying into a Marxist sort of dialectical view of the world in which they say, okay, I am in the black class, I am in the oppressed class, I am in the proletariat. Then there is the white class, and they are all part of the bourgeoisie. They are the oppressor class, and we must overcome them and engage in some sort of class struggle. And when I look at that contrasted with the likes of, say, Martin Luther King, who really seems to be fighting for more of what some might call a meritocracy, where you actually become colourblind and you treat people with equality and give them equal opportunity, regardless of who they are. To me, that's a very different approach. And that's why you see with this new sort of modern Marxist identity politics type focus, where people are now doing absurd things like haircuts have become the big thing now. You know, if you have dreadlocks and you're Justin Bieber or you're a white guy, that's cultural misappropriation. Or for example, to say, a white dude like me, who's just a typical white guy, meets a Sri Lankan guy who doesn't know and then says, oh, what part of India do you come from? Because we're a bit dumb like that, right? That's not that's not an act of aggression. It's not racism. It's not my privilege coming out. It's me trying to make dialogue with you and just clumsily, as human beings do, sort of mucking my way through it, you know?
Two things. Let's talk about the Bieber one first. And this is where I feel really shitty for black culture. And the reason why I feel really shitty for black culture is, again, like, this is people who, for the longest time, just black American culture, for example, they've had everything that they've kind of like appreciated kind of taken from them. So to the point of jazz music, to the point of country music being like literally ripping off like black artists, to the point where they've become very, very fragile, where they don't feel they can actually keep anything. And that's because throughout the history, even the guy who made Jack Daniel's bourbon was a black dude. He doesn't get any like recognition for any of that. So I generally feel like they do feel really tender, almost too much. For example, I have a friend who said, yeah, there's someone who was talking about how like this lady put like an avocado in a sushi and called it California rolls. That's cultural appropriation. And he goes, I don't think the Japanese culture actually cares about this little lady in California who's making these sushi rolls, because everybody knows that the Japanese culture is strong enough to actually withstand that to a certain extent. But if you come from a culture that's not necessarily strong enough to withstand that, where your culture has had everything kind of taken from it, where you can't trace your roots back to Ghana or trace your roots back to Guinea, like I really do feel really shitty for you in that regard. Like, I don't think it's cultural appropriation. Like, we can go back all the way through time and look at people who had back at people who were like cavemen who didn't comb their hair. Like, they would end up having dreads. I think the difference there becomes when a black dude gets dreads, he gets perceived in a certain way that Justin Bieber doesn't get perceived. And a lot of the times that perception is he's unkept, he's jobless, he's this, he's that.
Yes, but here's a point. Is that, though, really about race or about something else? Because, for example, when I was a younger lad and I had hair right down below my shoulders and I did a dreadlock phase, and I had that exact same problem. People were like, oh, no, Brendan, you look like a slob, you look unemployable. And I really did. There was issues I encountered. And look at me, I'm whiter than white bread, for Pete's sake. So, I'm not convinced necessarily that just because, your haircut is somehow an identifier. I'm not saying that those issues don't necessarily exist for some people along racial lines, but that's why I worry about identity politics, because it actually segregates us, and it starts seeing things where I don't necessarily know there are things to be seen.
There is some truth to that, but at the same time, like, there is certain stigma that isn't attached to you, that is attached to you being scruffy, that's attached to other people even more so, right? So if we were to look at, I think it was Sandy Darity who came out and said that black college students had the same rate of getting jobs as high school dropouts who are white. So like if you're a black college student and you have that haircut as the same, you'll perceive it the same place and same time and same status as someone who didn't even go to high school. But going back and looking at that microaggression.
But hold on, no, let's go back to that there. If I was employing someone and they turned up, I don't care what their race is, if they turned up with a particular type of hairstyle that for me, I thought, okay, this person sort of doesn't appreciate appearance as much as I want them to in this role, the race would be irrelevant. It would be about the hairstyle. Do you know what I mean?
Look, like again, and that is you.
Yeah.
But like there are studies that show that it's not necessarily just you. You're a very enlightened person, and we're having this conversation, and we're able to agree and disagree. There are certain people who, let's say, they're absolutely fine with white supremacy, who completely discount that, or who completely like treat other people differently. There's a picture right now going around in Twitter that has the hurricane in Harvey, right? And it has people literally going out and finding bread and finding food. And the headline or the tagline on the same newspaper that said that black people were looting stores was that white people were finding food. And like that's regardless of hairstyle or hair color or anything like that. That's simply down to people's perception of people based on the color of their skin. So there is this overlap that comes there. And the sad part is, especially for American history, it's so bad, it's so convoluted, it's so toxic that it's really, really hard for people to take race out of it. And even when you do, people just feel uncomfortable with it in terms of putting class into it as well. But I did want to talk about the microaggression part, and I think I tried to like speak about this before, is like you speaking there and unfortunately saying that guy was from Sri Lanka. Is it a guy who you see from New Zealand, or a guy who's like, just give me a bit more context in the story so I can like try
Well, let's say it's a guy I meet at the bus stop. He's a total stranger to me, but his heritage is Sri Lankan heritage. And I clumsily ask him, what part of India are you from?
Yeah, sorry. Has anyone ever asked you what part of England you're from?
No, they haven't. But I don't sound English or look English, right? But if I was in Africa and I sounded English, and someone sat next to me in a bus stop and said to me, what part of England are you from? I wouldn't go, oh, how dare you, you microaggressor. I'd say, look, I'm not from England, you know? I'm from X, Y, and Z. I wouldn't proceed to think, oh, they look down on me, they think less of me, or there's somehow some privilege going on here. I don't see how that is an issue.
And that's the difference there. The difference is the power dynamics aren't the same. The power dynamics are completely different simply because we live in this area and place. So like in terms of economics, we sit there and say that supply equals demand if everything else is equal. So if everything else is equal, then we can completely treat everybody equally. But if someone is fifth generation Kiwi and just look Sri Lankan, no one's going to ask him, what part of Auckland are you from? They're going to ask him, what part of India are you from? Whereas yourself, you might be fifth generation Kiwi, or you might be first generation Hungarian. No one's going to look at you from the distance and ask you, hey man, what part of Hungary are you from? Or what part of the UK are you from? Or what part of Ireland are you from? They're just going to accept you as being a Kiwi. Yes, and that's where that might...
Yeah, but the point is, it's not an aggression to even be clumsy and ask someone in that way. Like, for example, I often get taxis for my work. You know, I travel a lot. And I got picked up by a guy recently. He's white, but he's clearly got a European bloc accent. And so I ask him, it's very thick. And I say to him, as I often do with people, oh, I hear an accent. What's your heritage? And he tells me about it. And I say, well, how long? He said, well, did your parents come here? Or how long have you been here in New Zealand? And he tells me a story. And to me, that's a normal conversation. I'm not assuming that I'm better than him. I'm not being aggressive by asking those questions. I'm genuinely trying to actually form a meaningful connection with him. I don't want to stay superficial. I don't want to not ask him something for fear of this whole thing of that's an aggression to ask that question. And then we stay superficial. You know, see, this is what Martin Luther King, I think the Martin Luther King approach to, in my way of thinking and understanding him, is we should be getting together and understanding each other more. And that only comes through genuine, I'm not afraid to actually say and ask those questions, even if I'm not perfect at asking them.
All right. I think a couple of things. I think one, let's make sure we completely read the holistic approach of King, because there's a bunch of stuff that he said that were absolutely like, that you'd sit there and be like, oh shit, do I actually believe in this? Do I like completely agree with what he's saying here? Two, you asking someone because of their accent is not you necessarily asking them for their appearance. So since I've come to the UK, no one asks me where I'm from until they hear me speak.
Yeah.
When I'm in Australia, people ask me where I'm from all the time.
Yeah.
If I'm in New Zealand, people ask me where I'm from all the time. And that's in New Zealand, it's annoying because I'm a Kiwi. I'm from here.
But can you not also understand why people would assume that it's possible because of the fact that we don't have a large Nigerian population, do we, in this country, right? And so they wouldn't ask that question of a Maori person, even though a Maori person has a darker skin tone. They wouldn't ask them, oh, where are you from? Because they instinctively just know we have a large Maori population here who have always been here. Do you know what I mean? And it's not a racist thing at all.
No, but we wouldn't ask a Hungarian New Zealander until we heard them speak. And then we can associate that they're different after we've like heard them speak. So it's technically speaking, a Hungarian New Zealander could turn up to New Zealand, not say a word, and no one asks him where he's from. No one assumes that they're different. That's where someone could get offended by it by saying, I am literally being perceived as different. I could be 12th generation Kiwi here, and I'm literally perceived as different.
But here's the challenge for me. We are different. If you and I, we're side by side at the moment on the screen, and clearly one of us looks like white toast, one of us looks perhaps more like whole grain, to put it as crassly as I can. It's not a bad thing. It's diversity. And I think if we're going to celebrate diversity, you've got to be not afraid to actually admit that it's a real thing and actually embrace that. It doesn't mean I treat you any different. I should never treat you as an inferior person because of that. And I should never disadvantage you because of that. But I shouldn't be afraid to admit that it's a real thing, you know? And that's what when I talk about colorblindness, that's what I mean. It's like, it's not, it doesn't exist. It's that it doesn't matter.
Yes and no. Again, this is, if all things being equal, then it doesn't matter. But the mere virtue that things aren't equal means that it does matter.
How do we get them equal then if we keep focusing on the difference?
Justice, my friend. Everybody wants equality.
Yes, and how do we get there if we're going to keep focusing on the difference rather than saying, you know what? Maybe we should actually stop obsessing about the difference and just speaking honestly and treating each other as human persons. Isn't that a way of doing it?
Yes, but again, like, you're going to find yourself in situations where we treat individuals differently based on the situation, right? So we wouldn't treat me the same way you would treat a person who has a master's of economics if we were talking about macroeconomics. Like, we treat me differently, right? Mm. If I had the same masters of economics as that person, we treat each other the same. That's the justice part. So there's no point sitting here and trying to treat people equally if they're starting on different levels, if the plane is differently. We wouldn't treat a man and a woman exactly the same if they were going to war.
But but there is beneath that, like, there are, obviously that's based on the fact that they are different. But there is a much more profound and basic equality that we do share, and that is our common shared humanity. We are persons, and so we have that equality, and that's what I mean when I talk about treating each other with that basic respect, as opposed to the same in everything.
Yes, and that's, look, treating each other with the basic respect. That's just decency. Like, that's just straight up decency. That's, hey, I'm a good person. I believe in justice, liberty, peace for all.
But it's hard. This is what I'm saying. It's hard to do that. I'm not saying I still strive to be decent, but it's hard and it's easy to see why people lose that decency if you're constantly mired in this idea that, you asked me where I'm from, you're an aggressor. It's like, no. Why start from that point? And I get it. People do, like you say, a lot of black music was absolutely flogged and popularized by white people who took credit for it. Absolutely. I'm a musician myself. I understand that. And in another sense, though, when you see someone who says, oh, wow, that culture does something I really like, right? A hairstyle, for example, I'm going to try that. I don't know why the first assumption would be that that is an aggressive or wrong thing to do, you know, rather than, they think this is really cool as a starting point.
I suppose, like I said, the tenderness comes from, how are you not going to then give credit and say, look, I got this idea, inspiration from this person? What becomes an issue is when Kim Kardashian turns up in a hairstyle that's like that my mum has had since the 1940s or whatever it is, and then she starts it out, and people are now saying there's this new trend called box braids. That's the annoyance.
Okay, here's the thing, mate. I when it comes to identity politics, I do believe that Kardashians should be put in their own class, because and if you're starting at that point, it's all over. Like, if the world would be a better place if they just were denied all social media access and all television coverage. But I do understand there is and I agree, that would be a different scenario if someone says, oh, hey, listen to my awesome music that I've invented. I'm calling it white man's blues. You know, I've just invented it. Oh, really? Oh, white man's soul. Oh, did you invent that, did you? You know?
My name is Buck Cherry.
That's right. You know, so I do understand there are legitimate times where people do. Or the other situations when people take something cultural and they abuse it. So there's been a couple of recent examples of people taking the haka, the Māori, traditional Māori tribal dance, usually a war dance, and they are using it in adverts. They're doing it really badly wrong. And to me, that is, I get that, and I got no problem with that. I really had no problem with people saying, hey, hold on a minute. Because if someone took something that, I'm a Christian, I'm a Catholic, our liturgy is quite important to us, obviously, as part of our tradition. And if someone took that and then just completely bastardized it and used it for commercial purposes, you'd be upset about it. You'd say, hey, hold on a minute. You've taken something and distorted that's special to us. But I think just the general principle of someone necessarily copying a hairstyle, not trying to take credit for it, just copying it or doing things like that, I don't see that is some grave injustice there.
No, like Justin Bieber getting that haircut is Justin Bieber getting that haircut. People magazine being like, look at this trendy haircut from Justin Bieber. It's called the Biebertron 3000. That's nonsense. That's garbage, and that should be called out.
Yeah. Well, it's a fascinating question. See, I think we probably need to wrap things up now. But the last point we had to talk about, and I think it's really important, is the desperate need to recover a peaceful, respectful dialogue, especially about big issues. Like there's the bigger the issue, I think, the more urgent the need is for a respectful dialogue, and that means you've got to listen, and you've got to be open to listening to others, and hearing a wide variety of viewpoints, and actually also there's got to be a willingness to allow people to speak truthfully and honestly. But a big part of why I think things have broken down and why I don't think that's happening is I really do believe that we've lost sight of that basic human dignity that I was talking about before. That every human person has human dignity. And even if that person is expressing or believing ideas that I consider vile and obscene, they are still a human person. And therefore, I should treat them with basic respects, even if they say ugly and vile things. I don't have to listen. I don't have to agree. I don't have to stay silent in the face of that. But to turn around and say, well, I can treat them violently, or I can shut down everyone who disagrees with me, I see that as being a problem because, speaking of the shirt that you are now wearing, which is awesome, imagine if we took that approach to someone like Rosa Parks and just said, no, she should be silenced. She should be punished for doing or speaking or saying things we disagree with. You see, and that it's a real dangerous society we're living in when that's going on. And I think we've lost our shared humanity or lost sight of it, and we're not dialoguing peacefully as a result.
So there's this book I'm reading. It's called Happiness. I think it's by Matthew Ricard, and it basically says that essentially human beings are doing all that they can in their life to be happy, to avoid as much suffering as possible, and they're trying to gain whatever meaning they can in their life. And so we, in our own right, should do the best that we can to make sure that we're not trying to make sure people are suffering or having hurt in that regard. So if I take that principle on, how much time, credits, and effort should I give someone who is literally actually trying to speak about my denigration, my destruction? I'm here for other people's ideas and thoughts. I'm here for you telling me that Manchester United is better than Liverpool Football Club. I won't accept it, but I'm here for it, right? I'm here for you telling me that the bell curve is real and that I'm really part of the 2% of black people who can read and write. Like I'm here to sit here and say, okay, cool. Well, tell me more about why you think that way or feel that way. I'm here to have discussions about reproductive rights, or whether it should happen or should not happen. I'm completely here for that. But to a certain point in time, it comes to, are you advocating for my destruction? And if so, when do I decide not to listen to you? And when do I decide, you know what, I need to actually get on the defensive here, because if this thought continues and starts and spreads and gets popular, we could be in a different situation. Like we literally have, just going back to the start, we now have people waving Nazi flags in America. Like there's a war about this openly, no masks, nothing, walking down the streets wearing Nazi flags, knowing that the social climate that we're in, knowing that there are going to be social justice warriors out there doing this kind of stuff. So I essentially want to say, I say that to say, what does it all say about us as a society? What does it say about us and our moral beliefs, our ethical beliefs, if we allow certain things to happen and happen unchecked and unchallenged? What does it say about what we are comfortable with? What does it say about things that we are going to just sweep without the rug? And what does it say about us that in the West, we're more concerned about making sure that everybody gets a fair shake rather than simply right or wrong? If our biggest thing of right or wrong is this person said something dumb, I disagree with it, but I'll allow them to say it. Like, I honestly believe that we're really, really hustling backwards, and there are bigger and more important things out there for us to be looking at.
Look, I agree with you that we should not stand by while evil is being promoted and people are trying to advance evil. But the question for me is, how do we respond to that? And I think unless you start with that basic premise that even people who do evil things, or who say and believe evil ideas, are still human persons, I don't think you've ever got a hope in hell of actually cutting through this. I think you just end up with a constant cycle of, effectively, violent struggle of might makes right. And whichever group happens to be the strongest gets to decide what is right. And I also think you start to empower evil ideas when you respond in kind. I actually think, for example, that when you look at, I've read some really interesting stories recently of people who were KKK, even quite high up, who have come out and who now strongly renounce that and speak against it. And it's interesting. The pivotal moments of change for them there's a consistent theme through a lot of them, and it was when they had a genuinely loving and humane encounter with a person, usually a black person, a person of another race, who they had previously denigrated, who actually loved them and ignored the bollocks and just kept loving them. And that was the cut-through moment. Now, obviously, some people it's going to take a lot longer than others, and some will probably still die in their racism, which is why you have to have law enforcement and everything else and basic parameters to keep that sort of stuff in check. But the problem is that fundamentally, as a human society, the whole idea of freedom of conscience does matter. And that includes sometimes the freedom for people to make mistakes in their conscience. And if you start suppressing that, who gets to decide who suppresses that? What governs that suppression? Because the only way I can see us doing that is, well, we happen to be the biggest, strongest, loudest group, so we think it's okay to actually respond with violence in a mob mentality. That's what I'm talking about here. I'm not talking about a group of Nazis who try and storm a school full of black children and the police turn up and have to resist them with force, or even people in that school have to defend themselves with force. That's legitimate. Got no problem there. But if people are just saying things that we don't like, or are saying things that are even vile, and our response is, let's get vile in our actions towards them in response, haven't we failed ourselves? Haven't we actually, in a sense, empowered that vileness that underpins? Because what underpins them is a failure to see the human person and to actually just have that fundamental respect for the human person, regardless of who they are. And aren't we then responding in kind with that same sort of violence when we say, well, because they say vile things, I will fail to see their personhood and I will physically assault them?
Do they actually want to see the human person, though?
I think that's irrelevant, because I think the only way we have any hope of ever breaking through that is actually not through violence. I think that reinforces the narrative for them. I don't think that actually helps break that down at all. And to me, it's irregardless. So if someone comes to me and fails to see my personhood and is going to talk about me in a vile way, and I've had that experience from people who talk about me as someone who is of a Christian faith, and the way they talk about me is pretty vile. It's pretty evil, some of the stuff I've had said to me, but I still don't see that person as anything other than a human person, despite what might be coming out of their mouth. I still think to myself, you're a human person, and I believe that because of that, I have a profound obligation to show you basic fundamental respect, and I'm not going to denigrate myself and become just like you by resorting to violence to try and to deal with you, with the situation.
See, this is interesting, right? And this is interesting because, like, Martin Luther King is the one that everybody uses, who comes out here and says, look, let's show love, only love can conquer hate, like, and all this kind of stuff. But the way he actually did it was through shame. So he made sure people were caught on video with the dogs. He made sure, like, we had to sit there and see police officers battering people before we could actually take a step back and decide, oh, is this actually the kind of society that we want to have? Mm. Are those, one, my question is, are those people actually capable of shame? And two, why does it then become why does it then become my responsibility, or a woman's responsibility, or a minority's responsibility to then sit there and hug this person out and say, it's not your fault, man, it's not your fault, man, and do that thing from, like, what's it called? Great movie. Oh, I forgot the movie's name.
I'm not talking about some mushy postmodernist conception of love, which is meaningless. Love without truth is not love. It's that simple. And you don't get justice without truth and without love, all together working in concert together. And what Martin Luther King does there is, you would say he's shaming, but what I think he's doing is, you're right, but he's highlighting injustice. And he's saying to the world, look at this injustice. Are you going to stand by and allow this to happen? That to me is different, though, from someone who just opens their mouth and says dumb things, vile things, and then someone else wanders up to them, a total stranger, not law enforcement, not anything, and just physically assaults them. You know, like I don't celebrate punch a Nazi, just like I wouldn't celebrate punch a black racist, because I'm sorry, that to me, we're in trouble if we've got to that point, if we're celebrating that. Would Martin Luther King celebrate, punch a KKK member in the head on TV, and would he be sharing it? I don't know if he would. I mean, I know he was strong, but I don't think he'd celebrate that.
He'd never celebrate that, but he'd celebrate a riot. That's Martin Luther King. Like he wouldn't celebrate like punching, but he'd celebrate like the facing of property to show how angry and upset you are because you don't have a voice. And so like I sit there and I think of two things, right? Like Minister Farrakhan comes out and says a bunch of dumb shit, right? Right? Minister Farrakhan comes out and says a bunch of dumb shit. No one tells the Jewish community, hey, Jewish community, go down and sit down and have some trade with Minister Farrakhan and get to know him and make sure that you change him around and make sure he stops being the way that he is. It was the black community was told, hey, man, you need to go speak to Mr. Farrakhan and sort him out. And so at the same time, like it kind of falls on the people who are oppressed to, one, stop their oppression, but at the same time also prevent people in their community and camps who have been knobs. And that's where I sit there and go, this is where it's really, really hard, where I kind of feel like there's this kind of underground insidious comfortness in just being like, oh, this is the establishment. The establishment is cool.
Look, I'm not saying that they should have to put up with Farrakhan or that you should have to go and deal with something. Like I'm just like if a black man is being abused and racial on the end of a racial tirade, I've got no problem with him just walking away and saying, look, thanks very much, I'm out, as opposed to, oh, come and give us a hug. You know, like, what I'm saying is that's a confusion for me. Love, genuine love, is not actually about, oh, mushy, give us a hug. There will be moments where genuine love is simply to walk away and to actually take that harder road of not punching a guy in the head, you know?
Genuine love is making sure that the suffering doesn't continue through like physical violence, right?
That's
genuine
right.
love is, yeah, cool. Like I'm completely.
It's like torture. As soon as America started engaging in torture and all these dodgy practices, they lost the high moral ground. It doesn't matter what the terrorists were doing. The whole point was the high moral ground is we are not like you because we treat human persons as human persons. We don't kill indiscriminate civilians and all this stuff. The moment they started doing all this other stuff was the moment they lost the high moral ground, and they did become like them, you know?
I do, like, let's just get this clear. I do think that if we started treating people better and treated people equally, I think a lot of the issues that we would have is not going to be there, right? But at the same time, as much as it calls for equality, it also calls for justice. It also calls for people realizing that they've done wrong and making sure that these are the actions that they're going to do to make sure that the wrongdoing is paid off or doesn't happen again. Once these things happen, once all things being equal happen, then we can start going, boom, here we are, equality for everybody. But if it's not going to be like that, it's always going to be up and down, making sure we treat people based on what they've done with a previous history, based on context, based on social class, based on wealth, based on all these things. And like me most recently, I've had to take a step back from like a lot of extreme views around white people. I've had to take a step back from communities who like sprouted these ideas. I've had to re-engage and realize, you know what, maybe silence isn't consent. Maybe silence is just, you know what, I'm really tired. It's been going on for the last 30 years. I've got 3 kids and a mortgage to pay. Like maybe that is silence. You know what I mean? Yeah. So there's a lot of understanding that needs to come out there. But if we are literally going to sit here and say, let's treat everybody equally, let's have this place of love, and because nobody says no to love. Nobody says, hey, you know what, we need no more love. No one ever says that. Everybody says, let's give the love, let's do this. But what do people say when it comes down to, okay, look, let's actually put down platforms for justice so we can create equality, so we can take a step back? And I just think like equality is never going to happen. And so I'm very confident and fine to sit there and say, look, if we say we're this and we act this way, then let's never ever say that we're this. And if that's the case, let's be cool with it. So if we're going to employ racist people, for example, if Google are going to be happy with that guy putting out that manifesto, great, Google does that. But then Google has to settle the repercussions that they've got women in their offices and they're going to have people who are completely going to disagree with that and not going to go to Google, they're going to go to Apple. And that's how it's going to be. So if we're going to sit there and say, we are this society, we believe in this, let's uphold it. If we don't, let's take a step back. That's fine.
Let's just quickly talk about the Google guy, because I think what Google did was wrong. And here's the problem I have with taking that approach to this issue. Now, sometimes it's clear cut. If the guy stands up in the office and says, all women are inferior and should be subjugated in this workplace, you got a problem. And it's quite conceivable that you need to move that guy on. If a guy stands up in a workplace and says all black people are inferior and should be subjugated, you clearly got a problem. And that guy needs to be moved on. If you've got a guy who stands up in a workplace, though, and who says men and women are different, I think we shouldn't pretend those differences are not real, and that in actual fact, here's why I think perhaps this modern, more militant feminist approach to thinking about these issues of diversity is not right. I don't think they should be punished with losing their job for doing that. And the danger is we're never going to be able to find justice or even get close to justice, which is about finding the truth, right? If we just suppress everyone and punish everyone who we disagree with, regardless of whether their ideas are vile, evil, dangerous extremism, or whether their ideas are just disagreements. Like you and I have had disagreements today, but neither of us are vile or evil in the positions that we hold on these issues. And so why should you lose your job or I lose my job simply because of that disagreement? Do you see what I mean? That's the danger in not actually allowing. The danger is we don't get any closer to the truth if we shut down all dissent. You just end up with authoritarianism of one kind or another. And when that happens, the truth is no longer heard because no one wants to hear the truth. They are only interested in maintaining power and a status quo, right? That's what happens.
So the interesting thing is I had to read a lot of right-wing stuff to get an idea of the Google guy. And I ended up reading The Economist. Great subscription. Good. Go get the subscription of The Economist. It'll tell you a bunch of stuff you agree with, a bunch of you don't agree with. And they said that the poor thing about firing that guy was that it basically proves this point that dissent gets shut down by Google. And they're like, what they should have done is sit there and showed him all the ways that they felt that he was wrong in terms of he made no mention of social conditioning. He said that women were more about people, but then despite that had no reason to say why then there weren't any women in management positions.
Have you read the manifesto?
No, I have not.
I've read the manifesto and I recommend you do it because it's not as bad as some have made it out to be. And I also read a response from, I think it was 5 top scientists who specialises in these fields that he touched on, because he's actually got qualifications, the guy who wrote it, in some of these areas. And they said, although not everything is perfect, they said basically in a nutshell, he's got it right. The research does back up what he's saying. So that's why what for me it was even more egregious was what happened was the ideology took precedence over a guy actually presenting something that's true.
To a certain extent, we need to be careful with what these research and papers show, because we've seen in terms of history, in terms of context, in terms of culture, that sometimes it does not have the entire context, and sometimes
for sure
they're not necessarily peer reviewed as well.
Yeah, and you can't say, for example, a study that shows, for example, there are higher rates of illiteracy or lower college outcomes for black community, and then say that means that black people are inherently dumb and they're born that way, and we should treat them as lesser. Right? That would be wrong, right?
Yeah, and so there was the one point that really struck me, and that was he made the observation that women were more about people and more about feelings and more about looking after individuals in that way. And I was like, okay, cool, I can back that. But then why aren't there more women CEOs and managers? Because management comes down to managing people and motivating people and getting the best out of people in that regard. And they said that he made no real context for social conditioning and social contracts that make it easier for women to be pushed down one way or pushed down the other way.
But see, in response to that, I would say, and this is speaking as someone who is a married man, so I've got to speak very carefully. I'm a married man and I've got 4 daughters. The point is that it's absolutely true that men and women are different, and I totally understand why a lot of women are not interested in CEO jobs that men are, just because of the way we look at the world. And I don't think it's got anything to do with social conditioning. I've seen it in my kids already. As the other day, my very youngest children were there, and my little boy, they're both playing with toy cars, and my little boy says, "Let's roll out to war." And my daughters go, "No, let's roll out to save people." And they had this big fight about whether they should save people or fight them. And it was very typical of, I think, that masculine-feminine difference. So I don't, but the point is, I don't have a problem with the guy actually saying and raising questions about that.
And like I said, the point there is Google were wrong to fire him, because if they fire him, they're basically confirming his ideas about shutting down dissent. The other part there is, and this is where the social construct comes. So I'll give you an example of me right now, right? Sure. Right now I'm currently unemployed. Shit's happened, so I need to get myself a better job. But I'm about to move in with my girlfriend, right? And we're about to start this life together. And so I've gone from looking for positions doing community development work and charity work to corporate positions, because I need to make money to make sure that I'm there to help out and provide and all this kind of stuff. Yeah. At the same time, she makes even when I had a full-time job, she made like 6 times more money than me, right? But then I'm sitting there going, okay, well, when it's time for the family and kids and stuff like this, I need to make sure I'm in a high position. And she's going, okay, well, look, if this is what we're going to have, then my career needs to get cut short a little bit. So that in itself is like the social conditioning of we're going to start a family, so things need to kind of happen and change. So she can't necessarily keep being adventurous in her career because of that. So
but here, let's take a step back, and I would say in response to that, is that a bad thing? And here's the thing. And what I mean is, I think it's very clear that particularly in the early stages of life, while their dad definitely need to be present and loving, that the nurturing that a mother gives is absolutely essential, and she is more, generally speaking, more suited to that approach. And also, why do we say that a career in a sort of corporate world is even equal with, let alone better than, the profound career that is motherhood?
No one. I don't want to go into any of that. It's none of my business. In all honesty, right? Do what you want. Do what you will. But at the same time, if there's that woman who's trying to get that career, you can see the social pressures that is on her already in terms of and there was none on me. All of a sudden I'm going, I need to do this. Just something just clicks in me and I'm going, I need to do this. And I know that I need to do it. Why? Because there's going to become a time where Anna's going to be working and I'm going to be making sure I'm doing all the work and I'm going to make sure I provide for my family and provide more than we need. That's just something that's just clicked into me. I had no idea. I used to work in charities. Now I'm going, no, I need to get all of them checks, right? That's something that's not necessarily sat there and explored more by this guy. And so that's where you can have women in the office who are going to have to work with this person.
Yes, but the problem is, if women, see, here's the thing. It's not just reinforcing the narrative by sacking him, that they don't listen to ideas and they're not open to actually hearing alternative points of view that are quite legitimate. It's also the fact that they're effectively treating women as so inferior that they are incapable of being around a person who holds a different idea than they do. That's really troubling, right? And that's where the problems really start to come in. It's like, we must protect the little ladies. It's like, hold on, in the name of empowerment and equality, you're actually treating them as incapable of being able to be around someone who disagrees with them.
No, but see, it's not just simply like a disagreement. It's also almost thinking them as inferior.
But that's not what he said at all. He's very clear about that.
That's what I mean, though. It's saying that it's absolutely fine, but then coming out and not having these nuanced looks and understanding of social construct, of culture, and not suggesting that there should be more women who are managers because they're better with people. That's in itself is saying something else.
Well, but what he actually said was the reason women choose that way is because they have an inherent preference in their feminine genius that's my term, feminine genius, that I stole from someone else, but that's not what he said. But they have an inherent, in their feminine genius, is a desire. They don't want that. And so what we're trying to do is we're artificially forcing women into positions that they are not going to feel fulfilled in. Whereas men have a different inherent gift in their masculinity, and they are drawn towards certain things and they love them because they just appeal to them as men, as a general rule.
And see, now we've literally just lumped all women into this category that women aren't going to enjoy being in those positions.
No. In general, the general rule, there are always going to be outliers, but I think it's common sense to say there is a general set of principles or rules, if you like, that will apply to masculinity, and another general set that will apply to femininity, and you just see them play. Like if I said to you, for example, Kelechi, imagine this scenario: Saturday morning, one of the parents in a 2-parent household is in the lounge and they are playing a pretty full-on physical game of wrestling with the kids. Which parent do you think it's more likely to be who's doing that?
It's your wife because you're working the week and you're exhausted.
No, exactly. Now the social justice warrior goes, oh, it could be the woman, but the real world person who's got their head screwed on goes, yeah, it's the dad, and he's probably doing something really dumb and stupid, right? And there's another scenario we can do the exact opposite and show that most likely, because it's just true of the world in which we live. You know, it's not a bad thing. It's what it is.
Here's something that I want you to look into, please. So in terms of gender, like the construct of gender, there's the masculine. It's called the masculine. Have a look at it. It's sensational, right? And it basically lines out the spectrum between masculinity and femininity, and 90% overlap. 90% overlap. But we focus on the 5% of extreme masculinity and the 5% of extreme femininity. Yeah. And that's what we hold together. So if 90% are overlapping, that comes down to the 10%, which is completely social.
Yes, but in saying that, we if you talk about a biological issue, I believe our we are something genetically speaking, something like 98% consistent with chimpanzees. But that 2%, it's all the difference in the world. So 10% really can be all the difference in the world. And that's why we do focus on it, because that 10% is a big 10%, you know?
Cool. Like I can completely like take that and go with it. But as again, like I'm saying that 10% is it's not biological, it's socially constructed. So
I disagree. I would just, like, for example, there's some very clear things that are absolutely biological about masculinity. And for example, our superior physical strength is a general rule. That those biological differences have a bearing on the way in which I think we should live out our lives as men. I should take the gift of my masculine strength and put it at service of women who are, generally speaking, who are they are more vulnerable physically than I am. So, you know, for example, and I believe that the way I am made and constructed it actually is an inherent indicator about how I should live out and what an authentic masculinity should look like, you know?
And I think we're like conflating biological and socially constructed. So
yeah, sure. And there are social constructs for sure.
Yes. And that's where I'm sitting there saying a lot of what he speaks about, some of them completely discount the social constructs that come about, that create it, that steer women towards teaching, that steer women towards roles that aren't necessarily creation based in terms of like build something and destroy something. There are certain roles that are that way. There are certain roles that are taking away women from management because they don't have that drive, or supposedly don't have that drive to get to management, where they can then be in positions where they can start managing individuals and managing people. And so that's where I sit there and go, he's going to be in a position where he's going to be in offices where women are trying to actually have to have masculine tendencies or act more masculine than they would need to get into that position. So once they get there, then they can start being individuals who are actually more caring and loving. And
but here's the thing, though. What that's not what his memo says, and that's where I think it's important to read it, because the memo was about a very fundamental truth, and is that he's saying women should never be penalised. There will be women who want to do programming roles, for example. They just love it. But what they shouldn't be doing is artificially enforcing. And one piece of commentary I thought was very interesting about this. He said, you know, this whole idea of diversity can't be true, and on the one hand, if at the same time you're trying to enforce and artificially bring it into a scenario. Like, the whole point of diversity is that people are different and are going to have those differences, and they're going to express themselves differently because of those differences. And so this is not about social conditioning. There's a reason why the nursing profession and the teaching profession is largely, vast majority, dominated by females. And it's not because they've been forced into it. Now, what that means is, though, should we then try and create an artificial construct which says we will force males into those professions, or we will try and bring more men in because somehow that's doing a good thing? And that's really what he was arguing was, forget about it. Some men will choose that and they'll love it and they'll want to do it. Others, a big majority of them, they're not interested in that. They want to go and do other things because that appeals to them. Don't try and force artificial constructs onto what is clearly a personal preference thing based on the difference between masculine and feminine.
Now, just before we finish this off, what about the social? What about the social constructs that are in there that say to a man, "Don't be a teacher because it's for women"?
But I don't think that's a true social construct today, is it? In fact, in our country, it's the exact opposite. They're saying we need more men.
Trying to get more men in there, but that's what...
And still more men. They're still not signing up, despite saying that.
And that's why I'm sitting there going, we've got this historical precedent, this historical context that have gone generation, not necessarily for men, not necessarily for men. What you need to get is a bigger job where you're more in charge, where you've got more profession, where you've got more money, where you're more like... That's where I sit there and go, there are social constructs that are there that the nuance isn't taken into account. And when it's not...
And in response, I would say that it's one theory is that there is a social construct has created this scenario. And there's no doubt social constructs are real and they do create certain expectations. But in this particular scenario here, I think the other theory, and this is the theory I think is actually more likely, is that the majority of men look at the teaching profession and they go, it's just not me. It doesn't light my tires. And whereas a majority of women look at it and they go, oh, I love it. Caring, investing and connecting with a person in such a profound and intimate way. And they just, without even necessarily thinking that way, it appeals to them. Whereas a man goes, I want to build something or smash something, or, you know, or I want to learn how to shoot guns. I'm going to join the army, you know, and that's the difference, you know. But anyway, we've gone all over the show today. We've talked about everything. So, where do we finish this? We do need to dialogue, and I think this is what today's been about. And we need more of this. If you know someone who is different in whatever way, have the dialogue with them, for Pete's sake. Become their friend and genuinely connect with them and engage with them, especially if they hold ideas that you might even strongly disagree with, right? Would that be a fair place to finish?
That would be absolutely fair, but at the same time, like, think about your own self-care as well. Like, if you don't have to be explaining things to certain people, you don't have to you don't have to be explaining to people why you're Catholic. Like, and a certain point of time, like, you're gonna have to take a step back and realize, I don't actually need to be doing this. My mental health would be better off spent destroying stuff with my kids. Like, legitimately, if people want to have conversations with you, have them. If people are open to having, for example, I had one guy who I used to talk about white privilege to him all the time. And he was like, nope. So I stopped. And then he sent me a message one day saying, look, I read this article that shows me about how being poor and white is actually still better than being poor and black. And I now get like white privilege. And I'm like, oh, cool, great. But if you don't have that time, don't do it. Like, but please, if you do have the patience, if you do have people who are otherwise unoffended or otherwise unoffending people who want to talk, speak to them. Don't denigrate them. Don't sit there and call them all racist. Don't sit there and marginalize people and send them towards the alt-right or the alt-left. If they are otherwise unoffending people, try to have these conversations with them. If they're not, take a step back, and it's cool. Like, you don't have to convert everybody.
Yeah. And that's the point, right? That don't be a utopianist. We can't save the world, so stop trying to save the world. You know what I mean? And it won't do you any good, and it's probably not going to do anybody else around you any good either. Just be authentically human and be honest with people, and don't punch a Nazi. Right?
I didn't say that. I didn't say that.
Okay. Punching communists, that's okay. No, there's none of them. Don't punch anyone, okay? Unless they're first punching you.
If you're going to write an article about why you shouldn't punch Nazis, you should also write an article about why, Tamir Rice shouldn't have been shot after 2 seconds.
Yeah, and that's a fair call. That is a fair call. And let's finish on a very controversial note. Did you think that Floyd Mayweather was going to win that fight? My heart said Conor McGregor. My head said Floyd Mayweather.
I think it was the greatest robbery that we have seen on live TV. Like, I think it was the guy walked in the ring with a robbery mask on. He defended, punched him. The only way Floyd Mayweather lost that fight, right? And I don't know if this is your Irish coming through, but the only way Floyd Mayweather loses that fight is if he's scamming us and making sure it goes Floyd Mayweather, Conor McGregor 2, and Floyd Mayweather, Conor McGregor 3. That's the only way.
That's my first thought. I bet you they're looking for a second rematch already. That was glorious. Who's been this excited about boxing in a long time? It was actually quite good. So there you go. A black man and a white man punching each other. I don't know if that's the symbolism we want to end with, but...
And I wasn't, yeah.
Can we cut this bit out?
So were you hoping McGregor, were you?
I was just... Nobody was going to win from that fight.
No, we all lost, and they made a lot of money.
The only winners from that fight was Floyd Mayweather, Conor McGregor, and the IRS. Those are the only winners from that fight.
On that note, Kelechi, thanks for being with us again. And we are going to have to do this more regularly. I'm going to make an effort this time, and we're not going to talk about race next time. We're going to find some other issue to talk about, maybe boxing or something, but we'll talk about something. All right, thanks for tuning in, guys. See you later. Thanks, Kelechi.
Brandon, always a pleasure. Thanks, man.